Tucson responds to white supremacy.
Let us claim our own ways in which we're complicit.
And the mystery of a stolen painting solved.
There was absolutely no doubt in any of our mind.
Plus, traveling to next week's solar eclipse. This is Metro Week.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Barchfield. Thanks for joining us. The events in Charlottesville have been front and center in this week's national news. On this episode, we'll talk race here in Tucson. That and more after a look at the week's top stories from the Arizona Public Media Newsroom.
The Arizona Supreme Court ruled a state law prohibiting local governments from destroying seized weapons does apply to Tucson, even though the city is a charter city. Tucson began destroying seized weapons last year, but stopped when the case was filed. Tucson is now faced with the decision of whether to keep destroying guns seized during investigations or to change its policy to comply with state law that requires cities to sell the guns instead. Councilman Steve Kozachik, who sponsored the ordinance, says that's an easy decision. The ordinance will be repealed. The state can withhold funding from a local government if it violates this state law. Pima County wants to bring spring training back to Tucson. County stadium officials sent a 70-page letter to the Milwaukee Brewers asking the team to consider the Keno Stadium complex for its spring training next year. Pima County officials sent the letter after the city of Gilbert declined the Brewers' plan to move there. Tucson last hosted a major league team in 2009. And linguist and social critic Noam Chomsky is joining the University of Arizona faculty this month. He'll start teaching in spring 2018. Chomsky has been a regular guest speaker and has taught at the school for the past 5 years. He'll now be a professor in the Department of Linguistics. University officials say Chomsky told them he's looking forward to teaching undergraduates again. For more on all of the week's news, you can always visit our website. That address, news.azpm.org.
Violent protests in Charlottesville, outrage over President Trump's tepid response. The events of last weekend have resonated across the country and the world. We start our show with scenes of how Tucsonans responded.
1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your hate no more. 1, 2.
Before Tucsonans took to the streets, they took to Facebook. Just a few hours after, violence broke out in Charlottesville, and James Fields drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, injuring 19 people and killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer. Plans were in motion for Tucson's March Against White Supremacy and Racism. Barely 24 hours later, people gathered at Hotel Congress, and under the beating sun, began to march. An estimated 2,000 of them.
This is what democracy looks like.
I came out here because I was appalled at what I saw that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. This seeping in of the Klan, of Nazism, and, this kind of willingness on the part of people who have those beliefs to show themselves so openly, and I feel it needs to be countered.
Just wanted to basically offer my support for making sure that we have a society that embraces equality, that looks at people based on their merit, not based on their skin color.
I think our country is really divided right now, and it's nice to get everybody together for the same cause.
It's not in our making as Americans to hate each other. We should be loving each other.
The marchers walked the Islamic Center of Tucson and then down the road to a parking lot that sits in between the U of A's African American Student Affairs Center and Hillel. Organizers chose those locations to show solidarity with Muslims, African Americans, Jews, all groups targeted by white supremacists, loudly and publicly in Charlottesville.
Hate. Love Trump's hate. Love Trump's hate.
Many of the marchers said they were disgusted but not surprised to see images of people carrying swastikas and Confederate flags in Virginia.
It was surprising to the extent that people weren't wearing masks.
This is pure and simple hate. And you factor in racism. It's beyond, I think, what any of us could imagine. And it's seemingly being endorsed by the person at the highest office in the country because he doesn't speak to it. There's power in the words.
I would like you all to put your fists in the air.
Rallies like this one happened all over the country last weekend. So how were some of Tucson's 2,000 marchers feeling by the end?
I'm encouraged. I'm stoked.
My feet hurt a lot, but it's for a good cause.
And what is the cause?
To stop racism in the U.S.
I'm honored to be here with these people who are standing up, and it's heartening. But at the same time, the fact that this actually has to happen is pretty disappointing.
This is America. This is what I grew up in the Midwest, the patchwork quilt, which represents everybody, every religion, every color, irrespective of differences. We all have differences, but those differences do us stronger. This is America, and we got to act like it.
How is Tucson doing in terms of confronting racism? To begin to answer that, I sat down in our studios with one of the speakers from last weekend's march, Reverend Owen Chandler, and the YWCA's Liane Hernandez. I started our conversation by asking them to respond to a quote from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Here it is, being read last weekend at the march.
I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's first stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice.
That letter was addressed to churches, to white churches across the country, and so, those words were almost kind of omnipresent as my colleagues and I discussed back and forth through different social medias and emails and things like that. What is the faithful response to moments like this that occur, and what is then the ongoing response with respect that now that there is this kind of this flashpoint, this moment now in American history where we'd kind of hoped that many of the demons of our racial past had been buried in terms of the overt, just cavalier manifestation of seeing white supremacists walk down just normal streets with just unapologetic. They're tough words, and I think that they continue to keep individuals like myself to account.
Liane, can you point to some ways in which white people are complicit to racism and white supremacy?
There's a certain level of silence that exists and a lack of understanding at the ways in which privilege plays into day-to-day life and experience of community. What you have entree into, what spheres of influence you might have, what access to resources you might have. There was a good example of this sentiment that white folks need to apologize for being white. Well, no, that's not there's nothing to apologize for. We are what we are. How you utilize that privilege, how you recognize your own bias, and how that has influence in your community is significant. And so it's not just about white people being taken to task. It's about us collectively beginning to understand that we do not all have access to power in the same way, and that is significant. So it's not a matter of whether or not the Klan is marching through the streets at all times, but it's also about taking a moment and taking a step back and looking at the way in which people have access to food, housing, the criminal justice system. These things are rife with our history of white supremacism and racism. And until we take a look at that and acknowledge it and start to grapple with those very difficult questions and having these hard conversations, things don't change.
There's been a lot of talk this week about the need to not just be not racist, but actually to go a step further, to be actively anti-racist. What does that mean? What does anti-racism look like? What are some actions people should be taking?
I think it starts with an awareness. I think that it starts with kind of an awareness born of really looking at the context in which you live and taking stock of just the everyday situations. Being white in America is a lot like being an officer in the military, where in the military as an officer, I can walk into just about any room, right? And there is a decorum or respect that's given, regardless of whether or not I'm competent or not. And so I typically juxtapose that to being white in America, where I can walk into any building and no one's going to question my motives. I can go places. I've got avenues that are open to myself, to my kids, that aren't always necessarily open to many others in the community. What does it mean to be anti-racist? It is to kind of recognize that this dual reality still exists, and to, in some respects, try to not take advantage of that system, and to actively put into place little small things within your own little context that begin dismantling this dual reality that is unnecessary and that runs contrary to most of our deeply held convictions.
Can you give me just a few examples of what those actions might be?
The YWCA, we offer a variety of programming. Over the last 2.5 years, we've been talking about these issues around mass incarceration as an institution. So to me, engaging in that conversation, learning more, reading books by people who don't look like you, showing up for people when things happen in the streets. I think that Sunday was a really powerful event because it was a very diverse crowd. But there is a role, and there is a role of protection and safety that is brought when people of privilege are in the room and on the streets. The way that the police interacted with the crowds on Sunday was very peaceful. They made way. They created space. That was very contrary to what we've seen when people of color and communities of color have marches as well in this community right now, this year, right? We saw that with the brave brothers and sisters from Lupe, and the violence that they encountered with the same police force. And so that you see that access to power, access to community, access to public space is not equal. Right? And so the way that we show up for one another is significant.
Yeah, it's placing ourselves in intentional places of discomfort. That just doesn't happen. You don't have to do that, right? Like, you can create these little micro bubbles and live your life and feel like there are no other outside forces to your success or to your failure. Going back to Martin Luther King's letter, like, there are so many people, whether they're sitting in my pews or we're encountering them in the community, and they're like, "Look, I'm not racist. I'm not waving Nazi flags. I'm not waving Confederate flags." Now, that does exist in Tucson, right? I mean, there's trucks driving around all the time with Confederate flags, and so so there's this safety in creating these easy dichotomies of, this isn't my issue because I'm not marching with the alt-right. I'm not marching with these neo-Nazi groups. And so, just let me go about my business.
Tucson considers itself a very liberal, open city. Do we have a racism problem here that isn't being widely acknowledged?
Yes. Yeah, I would absolutely say that that's true. I think I love this community, but part of loving something is seeing it for what it is. And so while we show up for each other in a lot of beautiful ways, Sunday being an example, other public environments being examples, Tucson Meet Yourself, we have this celebration of diversity. At the same time, we are a community that is stricken with poverty, whose jails are filled with folks that are mentally ill, that are disproportionately numbered people of color. So yes, are we a wonderful, loving community that shows up for each other in powerful ways? Absolutely. Do we have to face, like the rest of this nation, a history that is riddled with racism, white supremacy, and privilege? Yes.
3 decades after it was stolen, a famous painting is back at the University of Arizona. This week, the man who found it came to tell his story.
David Van Ochre is one of the co-owners of Manzanita Ridge Antiques in Silver City, New Mexico. About 2 weeks ago, he and his partners went to scope out an estate sale in the area.
We walked in and it had a bunch of, decent mid-century furniture in it. But the family had already removed most of the smalls, dishes and things, and almost all of the art was gone.
Almost, but not all.
When we first saw the painting, I walked into the bedroom and saw it hanging there, and I thought, wow, great, cool mid-century painting. And I called my partner in and asked him what he thought of it, and he's like, I love it. And I'm like, great, we'll take it home.
They bought the painting for $200, not knowing the story of Willem de Kooning's woman Ochre, which was stolen from the University of Arizona Museum of Art 31 years ago.
Woman Ochre was on display in an upstairs gallery at the museum when the couple in question put their plan into action.
It was the day after Thanksgiving, 1985. Soon after the museum opened, a couple walked in, went up a flight of stairs to the empty second floor, cut woman ochre out of its frame, and walked out. On the 30th anniversary of its theft in 2015, estimates valued the painting at more than $100 million. Theories of its fate and whereabouts swirled. And all the while, it was behind the door of a master bedroom just 3.5 hours from Tucson. The day after David bought the painting, he took it into his shop.
The first customer that came in the door, might have been the second, but I think it was the first, and he walked over and asked if it was real, first of all, and that's when he went to touch it, and Buck grabbed his hand and said, "Stop touching the painting." And he said, I think you guys have a real Kooning. So he didn't try and buy it from us. You know, he did jokingly. You know, he said, well, you know, I'll give you $100 for it. He said, but really, you really need to investigate it first.
So David and his partners took to Google.
And page 1 was nothing, page 2, page 3 on Google. Page 4, I came across Anne Ryman's story. And I clicked on it, and there on my computer screen was a picture of the painting. And right about then, I just got this sinking feeling because I didn't know what to do. I had not a clue. I didn't know whether to call our local police. I just didn't know what to do. And so I said, well, we'll start with the museum. So I Googled the museum and pulled up the phone number and called them and got the receptionist and told her that I thought I had a painting that was stolen from the university about 30-something years ago. And she said, hold, please. And then next thing I know, I was on the phone with Olivia.
I was doing some research on an exhibition. I was at my computer. You know, my intern had just left. My coworker and I were having a conversation, and I heard an exchange take place on the security walkie-talkies where one of the security members got on the line and said, hey, Jim, I have somebody on the phone who says he has our stolen painting.
The next day, Olivia and a few other people from the U of A piled into a van and drove to Silver City.
We pulled up in our van, and there were a group of people out front.
When she arrived at the house, I went out and I gave her a hug.
I knelt down in front of the painting. I mean, I've only known this painting through photographs. I've done countless presentations on this painting, and I've talked about it to classes and, you know, the Arizona Bar Association. I mean, we've come to know the frame really well and the fragments, but I was absolutely in awe, and I just wanted to soak in everything I could of the texture of the painting because that's what I've never gotten to see in the photographs.
The room was just thick with electricity. We all felt it, and I mean, everyone just became emotional, and it was just such a fantastic experience, you know, and seeing Olivia and the look on her face and tears, and it just made we just all lost it.
Soon, the team from Tucson was back in their car transporting woman ochre home. The U of A's Nancy Odegaard was called in to authenticate the work.
Well, I was excited, a little bit nervous because while I have some familiarity with paintings, it's not what I deal with day to day in my work, but I was prepared. I had asked for photographs, and the staff here had sent those to me, and I'd asked for documentation. And so it was really, my approach was where Olivia, the curator, was so convinced by the brushstrokes and the design and a painting she knew by imagery so well. I didn't have that advantage, but I had the advantage of being able to scientifically, meticulously use UV light, magnification, and look for the clues. And so I spent the 2 hours really talking my way with people watching, looking for the clues of what looked right and looking very closely for what might not look right.
The U of A's Kristen Schmidt was there for the inspection.
It was very methodical, very professional, and she spoke to us and told us everything she was doing throughout the whole process. When it came time to lay the recovered painting on top of the fragments of painting that we had left, the old stretcher bar, it was immediately clear to everyone in the room that everything matched up. The cuts in the fabric, the paint marks, and there was absolutely no doubt in any of our minds.
And with doubt eliminated, it's now safe to say that woman Ochre is back home. So in all of this, does David Van Ochre feel like a hero?
No, absolutely not. No, this is just, I mean, we returned something that was stolen.
Woman Ochre was damaged a bit. The museum's created a fund to pay for its repairs, and the painting won't be on display until after that work is done. Now we'll turn to next week's solar eclipse. Glenn Schneider is an astronomer at the U of A who spent his life chasing eclipses around the planet. He calls himself an umbrophile. So what does that mean?
Well, an umbrophile literally is a shadow lover, but when applied the way that we talk about it, it's somebody who is really devoted to chasing and following solar eclipses, no matter where they occur, total solar eclipses, and specifically, no matter where, no matter when, somebody who's an umbrophile will find a way to get into the path of totality and see a total solar eclipse.
I love origin stories, so I have to ask how you sort of discovered your love of solar eclipses.
So it actually happened back in 1970, which sort of betrays my age a little bit. I had been interested in astronomy since I was 5 years old, or maybe even younger. That's when I got my first little telescope. I had learned about the total eclipse in 1970 along the east coast of the United States when I was 8 years old, when there was a partial eclipse in New York where I was living. It was total up in Maine, but I was too young to have partaken at that point. I'd read everything I possibly could as it was coming around. This was before the days of the internet, so really sitting in the library and reading about eclipses and so forth. And prepared to go see it, practicing every day with cameras and telescopes and how I would use every of the 2 minutes and 54 seconds of totality that I would see. And I really thought I understood phenomenologically, with causality, and what I was going to be in for. And so I had a bus ride down with a local astronomy group to the University of East Carolina, where we set up to see the eclipse. And when the moon's shadow appeared over the horizon as this incredible dark wall that was bifurcating the sky and was thundering in silently as the shadow just about came over us, and that last little bead of sunlight winked out and left a hole in the sky surrounded by this incredibly beautiful shimmering corona, the outer atmosphere of the sun, I couldn't move. It was literally just, I was stupefied, transfixed, frozen, and just looked up at the sky. I left my binoculars hanging around my neck, didn't touch any cameras, and just stood there and stared. And it was just the most amazing, dynamical, celestial, natural event that I could ever have imagined. And still, even having now been in the path of totality 33 times, you still can't imagine. You actually have to experience it. And I don't want to sound too metaphorical or anything, but it did change me. It made me an eclipse chaser right at that instant, and it stayed with me ever since.
And you mentioned you've seen 33 now total solar eclipses, and those have been, of course, all over the world.
They have been. I've actually seen 30. I was clouded out 3 times, sort of the nemesis of eclipse chasers. Okay. It happens every once in a while, but yes.
So what are some of the places that you've gone to, and have there been any that have really stuck out?
Well, they all stick out. The one I'm currently seeing is the best one. There's no question about it, and then the next one comes along. But it's been over all 7 continents, pretty much anywhere you can think of. I can sort of go backwards in time. Most recently, I've been to some of the outer islands in Indonesia, up to northern Kenya near Lake Turkana, out over the Norwegian Sea in an aircraft, into China, near Wuhan, just anywhere you can pretty much think of eclipse paths cross, and it's been a pretty large variety of places.
There is, of course, a big one coming up next week. Where are you going to watch that one, and why did you choose that location?
So I'll be up in a town in Oregon called Madras, Oregon. Oregon gets a bad rap for weather because that's the coast. This is inland where it's dry. And that's really the reason that I picked that site. As a lot of eclipse chasers will, it is sort of at the climatological sweet spot for the least expectation of cloud cover anywhere along the path of totality. Now, there's several competing places that are almost as good or as good, depending upon how you read the tea leaves, in that sort of swatch between Oregon and Idaho and Wyoming. But Madras has a few % edge on that in terms of the weather. So it's locating where, by climate statistics, it's the most likely place for clear skies. There's an expression that's shared between meteorologists and eclipse chasers, and that is that climate is what you expect, but weather is what you get. So anything can happen on eclipse day. So we'll try to stay mobile, but that's why we picked that spot.
How long will next week's eclipse last?
It depends on where you are along the path of totality. If you're in the path of totality on the center line, which is the middle of the path, it'll be anywhere from about 2 minutes and 2 seconds on the west coast to about 2 minutes and 43 seconds where it's maximum in the southeast U.S., and just a little bit shorter as it leaves the U.S. on the east coast in South Carolina.
And we're in Tucson, of course, not on that path where we'll have a total solar eclipse. What should we expect to see here in Tucson?
So here in Tucson, we'll get a partial solar eclipse. Roughly 2/3 of the sun will be covered by the moon over the course of about an hour. And it's well worth watching with either protective filters. It's just like at any time you would never look directly at the sun. Even with 2/3 of it covered, you still don't look at it. It's just way too bright. So you would use solar viewing glasses or film or project an image with a pinhole. You would not watch it directly. But you'll have an opportunity to see the moon slowly covering up more and more of the sun until it becomes a fairly fat crescent at about 2/3 coverage. And then it reverses itself and starts uncovering again. Not something you see every day. Make sure that you do see this eclipse. If it's at all possible to get into the path of totality, it's something you will remember for the rest of your life, unquestionably. Not everybody can get there. If you can't, watch the partial eclipse, but don't miss it.
Do you know when the next total solar eclipse will be, and where do you plan on watching that one?
Oh, well, I've got my plans out to the year 2079. I hope to last till then. I'll be 123, so maybe that's not too realistic. But the next one actually is, after this one, is July 2nd, 2019. And that will be over southern Chile and Argentina, which is the only place that it crosses land. It's mostly visible out over the Pacific Ocean. The path of totality passes north of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and then goes into Chile and Argentina.
And any idea when we might see one here in Tucson?
I actually, not in my lifetime, so I haven't planned that one out. I should know that date, but I don't have it in my head.
The U of A will be hosting a viewing for the partial eclipse we'll see here in Tucson. You can find details on our website. Now we head to the main library to meet a group that's memorializing drug violence in Mexico with a needle and thread.
It all started in Coyoacan, the park in Mexico City.
What started there were public displays of frustration over unceasing drug violence throughout the country.
A group of people started dyeing public fountains blood red, just the image of blood, making it concrete that all of this blood is flowing.
Hank says those acts of civil disobedience were risky, and over time the movement changed. Instead of dyeing fountains, people began embroidering handkerchiefs, and that action spread all over Mexico, and then to groups in Spain, France, Japan, and of course here in Tucson.
Each one of these handkerchiefs depicts a memorial to someone who has died as a result of the conflicts. Some of the handkerchiefs are in green, and the green signifies a desaparecido, somebody who is missing, has been missing sometimes, like with the Ayotzinapa students, for now 3 years. And likewise with the way they're hung, that blank spot is for people who are at large, nobody knows, and there's always the hope that they are still alive. So the Torres brothers were attacked with bullets in this particular area in Mazatlan, Sinaloa. This is the date. The Bordeaux that I embroidered this. This is Yeni from DF, which is Mexico City. And then the number of the case is 2,216 out of 90,000. So this would have been a couple of years ago.
Today, that number is up to 180,000, meaning 180,000 people dead or missing.
And when I first started, what really hit me, I did have the name of a person, but I wanted to know more about that person specifically. And what really frustrated me was it was like that person had been erased.
Hank didn't give up, though. He kept on searching for details about the name he'd been given.
His name is Jose Sanchez. He was just driving in his car in Ciudad Juarez. I think it was 2011. And he was driving in his car, and there was some gun stuff that was going on, and he caught a bullet.
That handkerchief that Hank embroidered for Jose is hanging on display at the main library, along with many others. Hank says they serve an important purpose.
There's a way of staying in touch with something that has been lost. How do you hold on to that and memorialize it, and also make present something that is no longer there?
Those memorials will be on display at the main library until the end of the month. Next week, a conversation with the U of A's new president as classes begin. Thanks for watching.